Geographically, we covered quite central India, Mahu, and from Mahu to Dapoli, Satara, and to Bombay, New York, and London. And if we look at from the tunnel of time, we covered considerable length of period, starting from 1891 to 1971. And if we try to really plot the path as to how the young child became Dr. Ramji Ambedkar at the age of 26, supported by his very benign and loving father, Ramji Sakpal, and his great teacher, Dada Keluskar, and his royal benefactor, Sayajirao Gaikwad. You can see how the various social experiences of discrimination and poverty, and also constant wavering of time and the global events that were taking place in the world, shaped the personality of Dr. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar. We can already see a lot of elements of emerging traits in the personality of Dr. Baba Ambedkar. One of the traits that we saw emerging in the personality of Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar is to have a very focused and very clear thinking, and also very independent sort of personality, intellectual personality, that we can clearly see emerging out of these experiences and out of these circumstances. So in fact, Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar was equipped with a mind which can analyze the social realities of the time. Not only that, but analyzing the social realities of the time, developing his intellect to such a level so that it can be used to create more social values. And that's what he learned, how to analyze the current dynamic changing situation around him, and how to develop his intellect so that it can be used as a tool for creation of the social values, for the creation or the transformation of the society. And he was equipped with that kind of a mindset. He was forced to come back to India, though he very much wanted to study, because his scholarship ended, and he had to leave his studies halfway in London, and he came back to India in 1917. So when he came back to India, he had no money, but because, as we have seen, that the Thomas Cook and Sons company, which was trying to carry his books, over 2,000 books, which he collected in New York and London, to India, they offered him some compensation because they lost the books. So that compensation was used, because at that time Dr. Ambedkar had no money even to go to Baroda. What would he do? So he parked some money with Ramabai, and he got a train ticket to go to Baroda with the remaining money. And he was on the job training as a military secretary. That was the on-the-job training for him, and he was groomed to become the finance minister of the state of Baroda. So he was to be groomed later. He was to be groomed as a finance minister, but his on-job training was in the field of military secretary. development of the society long back, as we have seen kind of landmarks in his life, earlier life. But this event completely changed his outlook. So he is coming fresh from a very liberal situation and having to face such kind of a horrible situation. It was really a painful for him. He tried to communicate the matter to the Maharaja, but somehow the information, Maharaja directed the Diwan to look into the matter, but the Diwan didn't pay much attention. His name was Mehta. And then there is another side of the story which I will go into later. So he decided to go back to Bombay. So he comes back to Bombay and his teacher and Guru Dada Keduskar meets him and they have a discussion. So somehow Dada Keduskar tries to convince Bhimrao-ji Ambedkar to go back to Baroda. And as it goes, he went to Baroda once again, but he couldn't find the friend who was supposed to come to receive him on the train station. He got a train back to Bombay the very day. So he comes back to Bombay in the same improvement trust chart, room number 50 and 51. Back in Bombay, such a learned man, having equipped with a PhD and training in finance and economy, having very less prospects in a place which is infested with the caste prejudices. And when he came back to Bombay, his stepmother died. So that was also another shock for him. So in this situation, when nobody is offering him a job, he tried to become a teacher, a private teacher to two students, to make his both ends meet. And it was a very difficult financial position because the Sakpal family has a huge family to really feed, and for them it was very difficult to make both ends meet, and also there was a dire poverty. And he worked with a Parsi gentleman on the part-time basis so that he can earn some money. He even started a sort of consultancy firm to give advices to people who are inclined towards investing in the shares and stocks. But because he was an untouchable, no client came to him and he has to shut down his business, because that was meant to be a business. That was meant to be a business in the service industry, looking into the stocks and shares. So he has lived like this, unemployed and jobless, for more than a year. A PhD, a very talented man, a very self-respectful man as he was, he has to live in dire poverty for more than a year when he came back to India. But in November 1918, we are talking about a considerable period of time in 17, and now we are in 1918. So the considerable part of 1918 was spent in dire poverty, unemployment and discrimination. In Bombay there is a Sydenham College, and there was a post of a professor for political economy. During that period, the economy was called by political economy. So there was a post for the professor of economics in the modern terms, and two people applied for that post, and the name of the other person was Joshi. He was also trained in London in economics, and Dr. Ambedkar wrote to Sydenham, whom he knew when he was in London, asking him to offer him the post of a professor in the Sydenham College. Kannan, who taught both Joshi and Dr. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar, had given opinion on both of them, and he thought that Dr. Ambedkar would be able to teach the students more better. And that was it. Dr. Ambedkar got a job for 2 years in November 1918. He didn't want to work for a long period because he had to earn some money, he had to save some money so that he can go back to his studies. So he tried to save some money, he tried to manage his family, and he tried to satisfy his interests in scholarship. He used to prepare his lectures so well that the students became very fond of him in a very short period of time. He not only got students from his own college, but the students from very many colleges attended his lectures and were very deeply appreciative of his teaching style. Even here, he was discriminated. He was not allowed to take water from the common drinking pot because the Gujarati upper caste Hindus didn't like that, and they didn't want Dr. Ambedkar to touch that pot. And here, Dr. Ambedkar engaged with a lot of social activities. We are in 1918. He was a very sensitive person and he was very much aware of the social problem. So there was a famous cricketer called, his name was P. Balu, who was from the Chamar community. He was a great bowler. But people didn't appreciate him because he was from the untouchable caste. Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar invited him in the Sydenham College and he celebrated him. He felicitated him. So we can see the traits of how Dr. Ambedkar was not locked in the caste consciousness. The people of his period were so much locked in their own caste prejudices and their own caste conditionings, but we can see very clearly as to how Baba Saheb Ambedkar has broken all those kind of caste labels and conditions. So he celebrated, he felicitated P. Balu, and later he became instrumental in getting him elected in the Bombay Municipal Corporation. Dr. Baba Ambedkar worked in Sydenham College starting from November 1918 to March 11, 1920. And then he resigned from his post and he went to London to continue the education that he left behind. So when he became a professor, he had a good salary, but he lived a very frugal life. He didn't spend a lot of money on the useless things, and as we know that he was living in a chart. And in 1919, because this is a very important period in the history of India, because in 1917, the British government declared that they will very progressively, they use the word progressively give rights to Indian for the self-governance. Before 1917, if you demand the right to self-rule, it was considered to be seditious and anti-government. But after 1917, if you demand that we need the right to represent ourselves, to govern ourselves, that kind of a demand was not considered to be seditious. And sensing this kind of an opportunity, the Congress and Muslim League, they wanted to have their share in the power. And here we can see the whole business of using the scheduled caste or the depressed class began, because the Muslims argued that the Hindus, they don't have kind of the share in the cake that they are demanding, because they are a fragmented community. The Muslims said, they argued that the scheduled caste are not the part of the Hindus, and because of that fact, they should not be given the share that they are demanding. Now, this is very interesting. This is beginning even before the advent of Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar in the Indian political situation. What we can say, the caste politics has already begun. So how they will share the power among themselves? So the Muslim argued that the Hindus They claim that they need more power. They don't, because they are a fragmented kind of a communities, and the scheduled castes are very different from the Hindus. We can see that there is a Congress Muslim League Pact 1917 in order to enjoy the benefits of this August Declaration. Historically, this 1917 declaration is famous as the August Declaration. And the British government wanted to move on. They wanted to give more powers to the Indians. But when we use the word Indians that time, it's very tricky, because we can see a political party organized on the basis of the religion, the Congress Party. There is another political party which is organized on the basis of religion, the Muslim League, which was founded in the early 19th century. There is not much a difference between the formation of the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League. And the Congress upper caste leaders were trying to claim the leadership of the depressed classes. They were hell-bent on making the propaganda that the untouchables are the part and parcel of the Hindu society. So they had a meeting in Bombay which was attended by stalwarts like Rabindranath Tagore and people like him. It was attended, the next day session of this Congress-sponsored conference was attended by Tilak. And he spoke very loudly in front of the people, but when it came to actually signing the declaration, anti-untouchability declaration, he declined to sign. So they were just trying to give a lip service to the problem of untouchability so that they can use the numerical strength of the untouchables to have the more share in the power cake. If this fact is clear to you, we can move on. The British government wanted to move on, and they wanted to actually take steps to give powers to the Indians. So they appointed a commission called the Southborough Commission. Based on the Montfort reforms, they appointed a commission called the Southborough Commission, and they had 5 Britishers and about 3 Hindus, and I don't know the rest of the configuration. And 2 representatives were selected on the behalf of the depressed classes. One was Vitthal Ramaji Shinde, who was from the backward classes but a progressive man, and there was Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, because he was the most educated man among the depressed classes. And when Dr. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar, at the age of, you can imagine, at the age of 28, testifying, and the commission, the members of the commission are asking questions about the Brahmins, non-Brahmins, about the caste system to such a young man, and Dr. Ambedkar is very fearlessly, with his clear arguments, he is arguing the case of the separate electorate for the depressed classes. And that testimony is still available, and we are going to go into that when we look at the writings of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar. But something which very much emerged from Dr. Ambedkar's testimony is that the British government must include the rights of the depressed classes when the power is transferred to the Indians. So this point he made very clear to the Southborough Commission, which was also called the Franchise Commission, because that was meant to give the voting rights to the Indians. When the final proposal came up, it didn't give the separate electorate for the depressed classes or the untouchables, but it reserved some seats for the depressed classes in several British provinces, and the depressed classes were allocated or reserved 2 posts in the Bombay Presidency, 1919. And we can imagine that the depressed classes had no strength, because their representative, the people who were representing them, were from the upper caste. And Dr. Ambedkar fought very hard. He said that he didn't want to accept the leadership of the Congress for the depressed classes. He said that we have the caliber, we have the talent to represent our own interests. So when Vittal Ramji Shinde was arguing that he is representing the interests of the depressed classes, Dr. Ambedkar declined. Not only declined, but he very strongly criticized the leadership of Vittal Ramji Shinde. The same year in 1919, a very important event took place in which Dattoba Pawar introduced Dr. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar to Shahu Maharaj. And Shahu Maharaj, as Baba Saheb later called, that he was the leader of the silent revolution in India. That time he remarked. So when Shahu Maharaj, who was already the enlightened ruler, who had done so much for the depressed classes, became a very close friend of Dr. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar, and they became so close friends that if we look at the communication that took place between the two, Shahu Maharaj was so open to Dr. Baba Ambedkar that in one of his letters he wrote to Baba Saheb Ambedkar that he wanted to sue, he wanted to file a case against Tilak for calling the Mahars as the criminal tribe, the criminal people. That's the communication which took place in 1999 between Dr. Baba Ambedkar and Shahu Maharaj. And in one of the letters that he wrote to a friend in England, he is telling him, describing the personality of Dr. Baba Ambedkar to his British friend. And he is speaking very, very, very loudly and with quite a respect for Dr. Baba Ambedkar. So they started organizing the separate depressed class mission conferences, and they had a conference in 1918 in Nagpur. 1920 conference, which was organized in Mangav in Kolhapur. Mangav in Kolhapur, which Dr. Baba Ambedkar presided, and there were a lot of dignitaries coming from all over India. So we can already see that there are strong undercurrents in the Indian society, that people are not accepting the Congress, people are not accepting the Muslim League, but they are trying to, as it were, launch their own front for equitable distribution of the power. Because that's very important, the equitable distribution of the power. And in that very conference, Shahu Maharaj declared that Baba Saheb Ambedkar will be their savior, and that they must trust the leadership of Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar. So in 1920, Shahu Maharaj acknowledged Dr. Baba Ambedkar as the leader of the downtrodden people, of the non-Brahmin people. He also supported Dr. Baba Ambedkar to start a fortnightly called Mukh Nayak. So Dr. Baba Ambedkar ran the whole show, but he was not the editor-in-chief, but Bhatkar. Bhatkar was made the editor-in-chief. And Bhatkar was on the paper the editorial editor, and later on he started speaking against the newspaper, and then he wanted to start his own Mukh Nayak. So that very year, Baba Saheb Ambedkar founded Bahishkrit Hitkarni Sabha. So the 1920 year is a very crucial that he started the Bahishkrit Hitkarni Sabha. So after getting some help from Shahu Maharaj and also getting some financial support from his friend Naval Bhatena, Dr. Ambedkar went to London on September 20, 1920. He went to London. And he continued his journey into the vista of knowledge. He wanted to drink very deeply into the knowledge, so he continued his journey. He went to the British Museum Library, spent hours and hours in the library. He read so much in the library. So he followed the same course. He will be the first to enter and he will be the last to leave. And the caretaker of the library used to force Dr. Ambedkar to leave the library because it would get late for him. So he was the first to get in and he was the last to go out. And he started following his style of studying, focused, very attentive, very concentrated, writing the notes on the small sheet of paper, and when he emerged out of the library, he would carry papers everywhere in his pockets, in his bags. So that's how he started studying again. The food was not good. He complained very horribly of the food. The weather conditions were not good, and he was also ill for some time. But despite of that, he continued his study in the London School of Economics and Political Science. And he was also enrolled for law in the Gray's Inn. But because he was so much focused on his dissertation, he didn't appear for the law examination quite for some time. That was one of the reasons. And also the person who promised him to give the law books didn't give him the law books. So he missed his examination of bar earlier. But then he appeared and he also finished bar at law. So in June 1921, in a very short period of time, he gained MSc Economics. In a very short period of time. And he submitted his dissertation. He submitted his dissertation on the topic which is now known as the problem of rupee. It's a very beautifully structured text if we look into it very carefully, the problem of rupee. It relates the history of Indian currency. It's a very thorough dissertation. So he submitted his dissertation and he went to Germany to pursue another trajectory of knowledge. He wanted to study Indology and he lived there for 4 months. But then some controversy arose in England about his dissertation. Some people found it very revolutionary. Some people found it very challenging to the established British norms. So he had to come back and he had to rework on his thesis. And later on he submitted his thesis and he gained or earned Doctor of Science in Economics for successfully contesting his thesis, which is now famous as the problem of rupee. So having accomplished doctorate in science in economics and having finished his bar at law, Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar, who was now having 2 PhDs, and he was about 32 years old, having 2 PhDs at the age of 32, already a famous man in the academic circles. So when he came back earlier in 1917 to Bombay, he didn't stop there. He wanted to write more. So he wrote 2 very important papers during that period, and those papers are very important. One paper is about the small holdings in India and their remedy, how the small holdings lead to poverty, and how the consolidation and expansion of the land holding can have a very positive impact on the society. So his whole scholarship was directed towards the very practical problems. But during the same year or the same period, he also wrote a very critical paper on the principles of social reconstruction. That was a book written by Bertrand Russell, who was a very famous philosopher of that time, and his career was beginning to take off. And Dr. Ambedkar wrote a very critical paper on his ideas of the social reconstruction. So he is playing with these sort of very fundamental ideas as to how the society can be changed, how the society can be restructured. And Russell gave a few sort of indicators which will lead to the reconstruction of the society. And Dr. Baba Ambedkar at that age is dealing and struggling and exploring these ideas. As I told you in the beginning, that he was a very practical and pragmatic man. So his head was never in the imaginary world. He was up here in the world. He was quite present to the reality of the time. And also he was very concerned not only with the reality of the present time, but how to take or launch the society in a very better position, using his intellect as a tool, which is the essence of the pragmatic philosophy. So, in 1917, when he came back, the people from the depressed classes wanted to felicitate him because he was a PhD. And Sambhaji Wagmare arranged a program where many stalwarts were invited, but Dr. Ambedkar didn't go to the program. At the end of the program, the people who arranged the program, they went to Dr. Baba Ambedkar and they gave him the certificates of honor. So he was never hungry for these kind of honors. So in 1923, Doctor, because he was a double doctor, Dr. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar came back to India in 1923. Came back to India via Colombo. He arrived in Dadar by a train, and he got down from the train, and from Dadar he walked from Dadar station to his house in the Improvement Trust Char. That's quite a distance. He walked from Dadar to Parel. Family during that time suffered very heavily. The Bhimrao Ramabai, they had 4 boys and 1 girl, and 4 of them died. The 3 boys died and 1 girl died, so they had only 1 son left, whose name we know, Yashwant, and who suffered quite a lot. He suffered chronically from certain diseases. So we have covered a period from 1917 to 1923, and we will carry on our journey in the next session.